You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Tuesday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can come over and watch the broadcast, simulcast of this in video on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you can join the other Intrepids over there in the chat room and have a good time while listening to the show or watching it, whichever you want to do. So thanks for being here either way. You know, we've been going through this whole thing about why do you believe what you believe, and we got off into examining an overview of paganism. Then we went into an overview of Christianity, which morphed itself a little bit into an overview of Judaism, which was the basis of Christianity. We started talking yesterday about monotheism, polytheism. Where did this all come from? And why is that important to looking at a comparison between Christianity and paganism in the early centuries of Christianity after the death of Jesus and resurrection, as some would say as well. And so it's easy to get bogged down in the scholarship of this stuff. There is so much academic material out there. And it seems to me that the more you lack certain archaeological data, historical data on certain elements of this stuff, the more is written about it in scholarship to try to really prove one point of view versus another point of view. So you've got a lot of material out there and a lot of things to sift through. And today I kind of want to go into talking a little bit about polytheism and Israel. Now, this is going to sound an awful lot like a history lesson, but hopefully it's a very interesting history lesson for you, because I want to look at how Israel and Judaism was the basis for what happened in Christianity. Because as we all know, Christianity isn't really a different thing from Judaism, although it's become that. Christianity was supposed to be a branch of Judaism that believed the Messiah came, as opposed to still waiting on the Messiah. And, you know, if you boiled it down to the brass tacks of it. And so I want to look at, first we could go into looking at Moses, which I'm not going to do here other than in brief, because I wrote a whole book about that, and we've talked about that, and I've read the whole book, and I've talked about my particular academic belief on Moses for many, many years. And you see the little bust behind me there. That is Senenmut. That's the man I believe was Moses in history. And I believe Moses came along in the 14th century BCE, well, it would be the 15th century BC, in the 1400s, and that the Exodus took place in 1446 BCE, and the conquest and the wandering in the wilderness took 40 years after that before the people really started settling in Canaan, back in Canaan, and establishing the state of Israel, which would have been roughly in the early 1300s. And I'm going to tell you this, the whole Ramses and Moses story, I think is fanciful, and it's a nice tale, but it doesn't fit history. There's one historical hinge pin in the Old Testament that kind of tells you about the time when the Exodus took place. Again, if these numbers are to be trusted at all. And who rewrote these numbers back when the whole Old Testament was rewritten into the Septuagint. So all of this stuff factors in. But there are some people that believe there was a whole... That's a bad way to put that. There was a whole belief system structured around Ramses being the pharaoh of the Exodus. And this is because the Bible tells us in the book of Exodus that the Israelites, while slaves in Egypt, built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. Now, how can you build the city of Ramses when Ramses hadn't existed yet? So they were placing this firmly in the 1200s BC, during the reign of Ramses. The problem is this, is that whatever Moses wrote down in those first 5 books of the Old Testament, whatever he wrote down about the story of the Exodus, was rewritten. It was completely lost after the Babylonian captivity in the 500s. And when the people came back to Israel after they were released from Babylon, said, go back home, you can go to your homeland, that's when those 72 rabbis went to the Pharaoh of Egypt, who was Ptolemy II, the Greek Pharaoh, and they asked permission to go to the Library of Alexandria to study the scrolls and the old books there to reconstruct the history of Israel and the Old Testament and bolster the believers, the faithful in Jehovah, in Israel. And so that's when it was all reconstructed, the 500s to the 400s BC, right in there. And that gave us the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is basically what you have today when you crack open a Bible. Go to the bookstore, buy a Bible, King James Bible to the NIV Bible, all these different versions. The Old Testament is basically the Septuagint translated into English. Now, that Septuagint, in the rewriting of it, would have taken place right around 1,000 years after the events of the Exodus. This is after the Exodus, after the time of David the king, Solomon the king, and the whole monarchy of Israel, all the way up until the destruction of Judah and Israel carried off into captivity into Babylon. And then the release of them. And then when they went back and reconstructed the temple back in Jerusalem, when they reconstructed the Old Testament scriptures. So that's what took place in that 1,000-year period in a nutshell. But there is a hinge pin verse in the Old Testament, in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 6, verse 1. And it states that on the day that Solomon, the son of David, built and dedicated the temple in Jerusalem, the first temple, Temple 1, that was the 480th year since the Exodus had taken place. And so we use this hinge pin date and say, if you have a certain orthodoxy about believing how Scripture was written and maintain that there are some historically efficacious dates in the Old Testament, that this 1 Kings 6:1 verse is telling us it had been 480 years. And we do know that Temple 1 was constructed in Jerusalem somewhere in the middle of the 10th century, so in the 950s thereabouts. And so if you start doing your math, you end up with a date. You come up to a date of the Exodus from Egypt under Moses as being around 1446 BC. Give or take a few years in either direction. And I'm talking a handful of years in either direction. But the median date is 1446. And who was sitting on the throne at this time? It was a pharaoh named Amenhotep II. And it was the 5th year of his reign in 1446. For the first 5 years of his reign, 2 or 3 of those years, he was co-regent with his elderly father, Thutmose III. Thutmose III, if you trace him back 40 plus years, he had become pharaoh roughly around the age 29 to 30. His aunt, or his stepmother, Hatshepsut, was the queen who 21 to 26 years earlier than that had taken over as pharaoh at the death of her husband, Thutmose II. And then her father was Thutmose I. So the way this works on the calendar, if you try to give a date line for the existence of Moses, if you've got 1446 BCE, as the date of the Exodus. And Moses is said in the biblical passage to be roughly 80 years old at the time of the Exodus. You can date back 1526 or thereabouts would have been the year of his birth. And this was the year that Tutmosis I was on the throne in Egypt. Now, Tutmosis I had a daughter. Her name was Matkare. And Matkare became, later on in life, Hatshepsut was her regnal name when she took the throne of Egypt. Now, Matkare, at about in 1526 BCE, would have been between 7 to 10 or 11 years old, right in there. Now, this is the young woman who I believe was the young princess who found Moses in the Nile, in the basket, where his mother had placed him for fear of being slaughtered. And she finds Moses. I'm giving you this light without going into all the details. That's what the whole book was about that I wrote with John Ward, who had a different view, by the way, and we present both our views in that book. But Matkare would have been the woman who found Moses in the Nile by the dating system. Now, if you remember Moses' books, he didn't name any of the pharaohs in the Exodus story or in his own story. And many people believe that this was deliberate, that he didn't do this because he did not want to give them life. The life was in the name, the eternal name in Egyptian spirituality. Now, the other theory is that it's because it was rewritten and the names were lost along the way. But Moses did make reference to this young woman who found him in the Nile, the princess of Egypt. He called her Pharaoh's daughter. Now, that seems like an easy descriptor. Oh, it was Pharaoh's daughter who found him. Obviously, the princess. But Pharaoh's daughter was actually a title. And Tutmosis I, the Pharaoh of Egypt, had a daughter, a singular daughter that he named Matkare, and gave her the royal title, Pharaoh's daughter. That was her title. So I tend to believe, the romantic in me wants to believe, that Moses was remembering her in his works fondly by giving us that hint, that Pharaoh's daughter. And there were only 2 or 3 women in Egyptian history that bore that as a title, and Matkare was one of them. And so if this remarkable young woman who became Hatshepsut later in life, the female pharaoh who ruled over Egypt in a time of peace and prosperity for 21 to 26 years, then this is indeed a remarkable woman. Now, if she is the woman who found Moses in the Nile, it says in the biblical passage that she took him, but she first sent him back to his own mother to be suckled because he was a young child, and to be weaned until she was old enough to claim him as her own, which would have been maybe a couple of years. And so when Moses comes back to her, we have no record of this, but let's flip over from the biblical story to the Egyptian story. Matkare, as she grew older, she was married off to her brother, which is what they did in the royal lines in Egypt, Tutmosis II, who was kind of a weak and sickly king, and he died very young. But during their reign, she brought into her household a young man who she named. She gave him a name, a young man who had a name. We don't know anything about this man in Egyptian history, other than that he was a man who was born to commoners, that Matkare, Hatshepsut, raised to great power in her household. She brought this man in. He became the tutor to the royal daughter, Nefrure. And when she did, and by the way, being a tutor wasn't like a schoolmarm back in those days. They only brought in people into the household of the pharaoh to be tutors to the children who were of great nobility or had great military achievements. Things like these were the people they brought in. And keep to thinking about the age of people back then, how early they would have been middle-aged and got older and so on. This young man she brought in was probably already well into his 30s. and very accomplished. And she gave him a name. Egyptian history doesn't tell us his original name, but she names him Senenmut. Now, Senenmut means, in translation, brother to the gods, and Mot is in there as well. And so what it means, it means mother's brother to the gods. And so Hatshepsut names this young man, who is now in her household as the tutor, as a great noble, she names him Senenmut, meaning mother's brother. In essence, what she's saying is, I, your mother, am elevating you to status of brother to the gods with me. Is this Matkari? Is this Moses? Is this the young baby she found who was 7 to 10 years younger than she was, in a basket in the Nile, and she took into her home, and when he comes of age, becomes a great nobility and so on, she renames him, gives him the name Senenmut. Now, this is circumstantial evidence, but this is the case I built for this guy back here, being Moses. And so she names him that. She grants him over the years 92 royal titles: the High Priest of Amun, the Grand Royal Architect, and he was responsible for several amazing old structures in Egypt during her reign, including her funerary temple of Deir el-Bahre. And this is the young man who also became the Grand Vizier of Egypt under Hatshepsut. Grand Vizier simply meant Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh. He was one step off the throne, perhaps even being groomed for the throne. Now, Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferuri, died. She had no living heirs from her husband, but she did have a stepson from her husband and a harem wife. Thutmose III was his legal name, but he was a child at the death of Hatshepsut's husband, Thutmose II. He was 3 to 5 years old, and so she became co-regent with him for about 6 years. Then she took over the throne, and she sent him up north to Memphis, Mennefer at the time, and he was raised there. He grew up and became the general of all her armies, but never led a sedition against her, even though he was the rightful pharaoh, which means it was a great peace, and there was probably a great understanding between them. And he knew his place, and she knew her place. Well, during this time, this is the rise of Senenmut. Now, Senenmut disappears off the scene about the time he is 40 years old, just gone. He was also reportedly the lover to the queen in his later years. He and Hatshepsut were known as lovers, and there's a lot of information about that. But he disappears. He leaves behind two gloriously unfinished tombs in Egypt. One of them is right adjacent to Hatshepsut's funerary temple. And there's a lot of interesting things. You face her funerary temple of Deir el-Bahre, and down in kind of the ditch in front of the big cliff walls, his tomb entrance is down there. And it's got this amazing astronomical calendar all over the ceilings. But it goes down into the ground, of course. Now, on the other side of the ridge behind her temple is the Valley of the Kings. And you can find her tomb, which he constructed. And you follow down the shafts all the way down underground to her tomb, and you find this. If you were to do a slice away and turn that sideways and look, you had her temple, the mountains in between of the Theban mountains, Valley of the Kings here, Senenmut's tomb way over here out east of the front entrance of Deir el-Bahre, her temple. You go down underground to his actual tomb chamber, which was never used. You go over to Hatshepsut's tomb over in the Valley of the Kings and travel down underground to her tomb chamber. Those two tombs line right up and are just a wall of rock between them. So there was something very telling about, maybe very romantic, if you will, about the way Senenmut constructed those tombs to be right next to each other underground with the Theban mountain peaks right in between, and it's a ridge is what it is, and her temple. So he had a relationship with Hatshepsut, but he disappears. And what's interesting is after he disappears, Hatshepsut dies. Very short time. It may have even happened first, but we're not sure. And there's no mention, with all the mention of Senenmut, all the glorious structures he built, all of his royal titles, the fact that he was a grand vizier, that he had these 2 unfinished tombs. There is no mention of what happened to him. He was just gone off the Egyptian records. And I believe that this coincides with the biblical story when it says that Moses and his entourage saw the Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. And I don't think it was a big secret like the stories that his background was the fact that he was from Israelite slaves at the time. Now remember, even Senenmut, what we know about him in Egyptian history, said he was born of commoners. We don't know who, it says, but he was elevated to great heights by Hatshepsut. So it says he murdered this Egyptian who was beating the Hebrew slave. And because he thought it would be found out, he flees Egypt, and he's gone. This is Moses at age 40 in the scriptural story. And he comes back, he returns back to Egypt 40 years later when he's 80, after he has this burning bush experience, and which he was the only one who saw, so that's his story that he recorded down, and he's told to go back and deliver God's people from bondage in Egypt. Now, it's a very romantic story, and all of those details get a little lost. But back in Egypt now, in Egyptian history, Senenmut is gone. Hatshepsut's dead. The rightful pharaoh, now about 29 or 30 years old, Tutmosis III, takes his rightful place as pharaoh. And he reigns for another 40-plus years, about approximately 40 years. And one of the first things he does, though, he starts to strike all the images of Hatshepsut off of her temples and off of different temples and statuary and so on, and has his own name carved in the place. That's a process of erasure, which was very common in Egyptian history. But he left off at a point and didn't eradicate everything. But later now, let's advance almost 40 years. He's getting old and elderly and a little sickly, and his son Amenhotep II is 18 years old and becomes the co-regent with his father. And after the death of Tutmosis III, Amenhotep II, the son, conducts 5 successful military campaigns in the first 5 years of his reign. So he's about 23 years old after he has these 5 successful campaigns. According to the biblical timeline, if Moses indeed came back, Senenmut returned as Moses, his birth name. Moses, by the way, Tutmosis the first, second, and third. Ramses is Ra-Moses. Amos is Ah-Moses. The name Moses was fairly common in Egypt, but he comes back at age 80, according to the biblical story. Now, if this is indeed Senenmut, what happens 40 years after the disappearance of Senenmut? Tutmosis III takes the throne, dies, his son takes over, and right in 1446, smack in the middle of the 5th year of his reign, suddenly all military campaigns stop. There's a quiet time in Egypt. There's no military activity. What I believe took place there was Moses came back. There was the Exodus, the 10 plagues, all of these things. No matter how you want to describe them, it may have been a rebellion he led. It may have been a series of events, natural occurrences, that allowed him to do what he did, but the Exodus took place. And Moses leaves with all the Hebrews, the Israelites, and that this happens in 1446 BC. And the Pharaoh lives on for quite a lengthy reign. But then you've got Moses, who's gone out with the people to travel toward Canaan and what eventually becomes Judah and the Judean wilderness and what is now Israel in present day. And so you've got this story of this character. And it was Moses, I believe, that came and codified the worship of a singular God in Israel. The Israelites were not Jewish. Judaism didn't exist until Moses codified it. And we're going to get more into that after the break. I think I've run a little long here, so we're going to get out of here for 2 minutes. We'll be right back. Sit tight. All right, folks, thanks for hanging on during that break. This is Scotty Roberts, the Intrepid radio program, right here on Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com. And if you're watching over on the YouTube stream, folks, and if you want to come over there, join the chat room. It's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. We left off at kind of a critical point, and I had run a little long in that segment, and so I had to cut it off abruptly. But I was talking about this story of Moses. And Moses, I believe, no matter what you believe about his origins and who he was, I think he was that guy back there, Senenmut. Moses codified Judaism. And it was Moses who took the Israelites out and wrote the law. And if this is Moses, was this Senenmut? What we do know about Moses from the scriptural story, highly educated in the courts of Egypt. 40 years of his life was spent there. Jewish tradition places him as a general and a military commander as well. Moses would have been schooled in all the education, the academics of Egypt, as well as the finest schools in the world, than the religious studies of a noble growing up in Egypt. And he would have been just immersed in Egyptian spirituality and religion. He would have learned of all the religions from the Sinaitic region, from the Mesopotamian region, from Africa, south of Egypt. He would have learned all these things. And what we find is, if you look at between the lines a bit in the story in the Old Testament, he's incorporated a lot of these things into the creation of Judaism. And so he codified Judaism. He codified a one God, a monotheistic God in Israel. And this is why he had so much problem with the people during the time that he was leading them. And so that in a nutshell, boy, that was the nutshell version of the story. And by the way, I'm going to give you a quick little plug here. if you want to pick that book up, I've got a few of them here. It's the Exodus Reality. I wrote about this with John Ward, also presented his theory. I've got some of these, so if you want one of these, you can go get them at Amazon. You can get them through my publisher. You can get them in bookstores all around the nation. But if you want to pick up one from me, I've got some here. Just contact me, and I can get one for you. You can read the whole theory. And that wasn't supposed to be... And you know that stuff I just talked about? Well, buy my book. That's not what that was. I'm just saying, I've got it all. This is what I wrote about in that book. So let's move on. You've got the story of Moses. And I thought that that was an important part of understanding where monotheism is going to come from. Or where it came from in Israel. It came from Moses establishing it. There are vast theories, and of course, different theories of Moses. There are theories that attach Moses to Akhenaten, which I think is incorrect. I don't think Akhenaten had anything to do with Moses. But Akhenaten would have come along roughly, a generation past the time when Moses would have led the Israelites out of Egypt. And so there's some interesting corollaries there. How Akhenaten started believing in a singular God, a monotheistic God, the Aten. How that was all deconstructed after his death and moved back to Thebes in the polytheistic system. And during the same time, this would have been, during the time that the Israelites were out in the desert, wandering for 40 years. And so Moses brings them into the land. And now I want to take a look at kind of the flip side of that. Israel and polytheism. What about this whole polytheistic thing in Israel? Why was it you find all through the Old Testament, once the Israel was established in the land, in the Middle East, and David the king and Solomon, and before them the Judges period that took place, the 480 years between the Exodus and the time of Solomon. There was this constant struggle with, in the biblical scriptures, the Old Testament, of God telling the people you're worshiping Baal and Asherah, goddesses and other gods, and not sticking to monotheistic religion, not sticking to Jehovah worship. And there would be punishment, and then restoration, and then the sin happening again, according to the biblical story. So there was polytheism in Israel through this whole time. So whether or not Israel existed as a tribe prior to their sojourn in Egypt and slavery, whether they existed as a nation state, which there's still controversy about that, and I don't know why. There are archaeological discoveries and finds that firmly establish Israel was a state. Not only in Israel, but around the ancient Middle East and in Egypt itself. What their ethnic identity was before the writing of the Old Testament literature. They were a family. They were the family of Jacob, whose name was also Israel, and his 12 sons, and they moved to Egypt. They became the nation of Israel after the Exodus. And according to archaeologist William Deaver, in the area believed to be the region of Israel, there arose about 300 small agricultural hilltop villages in the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. And these villages were small. We're talking about 200 to 300 years before the time that King David became the king, and Solomon and the building of the temple, so that which was in the 10th century. So in the 13th, 12th to 13th centuries, these villages, they were small. They were no larger than 4 or 5 acres. They sat on hills near water sources and fertile valleys. They were unwalled, most of them. They had no defenses, and most were located in the central hill country north of Jerusalem. Deaver, the archaeologist, points out that there's a notable absence of pig bones in excavations. Now, you might not think much about that, except that was one of those animals that was considered unclean in Judaism. And unlike the Assyrian settlements all around them, there were no temples or shrines discovered. amongst all these hill states. However, for one in the Sumerian hills containing a bronze bull figurine of the deity El. E-L. And we discussed him earlier. We'll probably discuss him again. El comes from Enlil of the Anunnaki gods in the Mesopotamian region. And 1,500 years later, as people moved into the Canaanite region, El became the name for God, and the Hebrews picked it up with Elohim, El Elyon, El Shaddai, and names like that. And the bronze bull was the symbol of El that they found in one place in all these different hill cities. And Israel wasn't known by the name of Israel until the late 11th century BCE. This victory stele of the pharaoh Merneptah, dated to 1210 BCE, celebrates the pharaoh's victories over enemies, including Israel, and he's got the name Israel in there, in 1210 BCE, which he laid waste to. And this reference to Israel is to a political, it's not known if it's to a political or an ethnic entity, and not, is it a reference to a person or a place, was the question when they saw this. Because this kind of flew in the face of the scholars who did not want to accept that Israel, because there was such a lack of archaeological evidence, ever existed as a state, as a nation. And so once they find stuff like this, they have to try to explain their way around it. The observation that on an Assyrian stele, the only relevant reference is to the house of Omri. Now, Omri was one of the kings of the region who was a descendant of Solomon and identified as an Israelite king in the Old Testament. Jehu is the same, also a king, called the son of Omri. And the only capital city for this region mentioned in Assyria in their historical records is in Samaria. And it's in this kingdom which fell to the Assyrians in 722 BCE. Now remember, Israel and Judah, I don't know if you remember this, they became a divided kingdom. It was David who united all the northern tribes. And after Solomon's time, it splintered again into Israel and Judah. Judah in the south, Israel in the north. And the capital city of Judah being Jerusalem, and Israel was up in the Sumerian area. And so the debate among scholars just goes on and on and on. Now, the book of Joshua, which comes after the first 5 books of the Bible, written by Moses, tells the stories of numerous battles that were waged by the Israelites against the Canaanites. And as the Israelites conquered over 40 cities in the region in order to claim their promised land. However, it's noted that the conquest history of Joshua isn't really supported by archaeology. It's stories, but it's not saying it didn't happen. It's saying the archaeological evidence that, instead of a paper trail, that rock trail has been very hard to follow and very hard to establish. And only in recent years have we found more and more to establish that this happened this way. There wasn't a lot of destruction that was shown. We do have Jericho, where the walls came tumbling down. We've talked about this in other areas, other studies before. But Jericho, it says you go there today, and you can find the remnants of the city in Tel Sultan, which is the old city. It's a mound outside of current-day Jericho. And you can, frankly, in the middle of it. And this is the old city, and they found that the walls were toppled down. And they give this to earthquake and things like that. And what's also interesting is the destruction of that city under Tel Sultan at Jericho is dated to about 1405 BCE. 1405. And that no one lived there for about 800 years, making that what? 600s before anybody lived there again in Tel Sultan, Old Jericho. Now, what's also interesting is that, remember we talked about the Pharaoh Ramses II, the Pharaoh of the Exodus? He lived in and around 1250 BCE, in his reign in there. Yet, if he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus and the whole exodus into the wilderness after under Moses and Joshua taking over and the destruction of the city of Jericho, if that destruction is actually archaeologically dated to 1405, it would have been destroyed a good 150 to 200 years prior to the time of Ramses II. And so if they indeed did that, the Israelites did that, they existed and had the Exodus long before Ramses was born. Anyway, let's move on. So the book of Joshua talks about these conquests of the land. And of the supposed 40 cities he conquered, only 2 or 3 are even potential candidates for some form of conquest, as most of the other cities either didn't exist in that period, or if they did, they show no destruction. And now, what you can gather by this, too, is there's probably a mixture of false data, later data, renaming of cities, or there is, as we mentioned earlier, talking about the Septuagint mentioning Pi-Ramses as the treasure cities built by the Israelites when they were slaves. What those old documents don't tell you, the Septuagint, was at the time, it's 1,000 years later, and they had forgotten that beneath what was present-day Pi-Ramses at that time was the city of Avaris. And Avaris is the city that would have been built by the Hebrews, by the Israelites. And all Ramses II did was he rebuilt the city of Avaris. Probably not with Israelite slaves. Most likely not. So, in going through the same thing with the cities that Joshua conquered. So, the region was fairly unpopulated, except for certain regions, certain cities in the region. And so there was no need for conquest. The problem with this is they keep discovering little cities that existed that didn't exist at the time that this was put forward. All these cities didn't exist. Well, they keep finding them. And, excuse me, conquest didn't mean that they came in and tore down the cities. It meant they came in and they occupied the cities. So those cities did exist. Israel was initially formed by displaced Canaanites, according to some. In fact, most of those who came to call themselves Israelites were or had been indigenous Canaanites, according to Deaver. And what might have happened to displace a large number of Canaanites and cause a population shift to the hill country? We don't know. It's just his theory. So interestingly, Deaver notes that in 1500 BCE, there had begun this long, slow decline in the entire Mediterranean region, including Canaan and Egypt and Greece. And this decline involved increased lawlessness, corruption of officials, burdensome taxation, increased poverty. Who was doing the taxing during this time? If they were on the decline and there was no social structure there, no civilized structure. Eventually, the Canaanite government collapsed. The region regressed to political anarchy for at least 2 centuries, and during this period, urban populations decreased significantly. And this is what some of these people, these scholars, attribute to the rise of Israel, is these displaced Canaanites. Now, that's a possibility, that a lot of these city-states, these towns that were in the region, were amalgamated into the influx of the Hebrews coming from Egypt, reestablishing there. So there's a lot of evidence out there to sustain this, but there is a lot of mixed scholarship on it. And so what we want to look at specifically is this whole idea of how monotheism took hold in Israel and the polytheism that existed there. According to Deaver, the settlers in the hill country were probably composed of several different groups, including refugees, people escaping corruption or plague in the cities, bandits, local nomads. And there was a group of roving bandits called the Apiru, who were complained of during the time of Akhenaten, and were mentioned in letters sent to him, the Amarna letters, who caused disruption in the region. And for some time, some of the scholars believe that the word Apiru is the root for Hebrew, while others disagree. And it really is not the same word structure. The etymology of the word is very different, so it's not the same. So the hill country settlements continued only until about the 10th century, at which time they were abandoned for the larger towns, the larger cities. But then you've got the city of Salem that existed for a long time before that. There were large cities. The city of Salem, of course, is Jerusalem. And they abandoned all the little towns for the bigger towns. They went into the large fortified cities such as Dan, Hatzor, Megiddo, Tanakh. And there's some belief that the displaced Canaanites who settled the hill country are the people who would eventually call themselves Israelites, and would later be identified by the Assyrians as the house of Omri. And so this is one version of how things took place. You've got the biblical version, which says they were definitely refugees moving into the land, making something of the land, interbreeding with the people who were there, sometimes wiping out the people who were there, and taking over the cities. And so the religion of the early Israelites most likely grew out of the Canaanite region, which is an obvious thing, obviously, because it was Canaanites that comprised, that lived in the region of Canaan. It was the Israelites who moved in and were now a family member that were once Canaanites, now moved back into the land. And I think that there was a lot of merging of all these peoples together. And the Israelite sacrificial system and the liturgical year was Canaanite. Even the Hebrew language of the Bible is a Canaanite dialect. And some of the early Hebrew was written in Canaanite script. Some of the Psalms and the poems in the first 5 books of the Bible, in the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, are very close to Canaanite poetry. Biblical historian Professor Bernard Lang notes that during the years of the Israelite monarchy, identified in the Bible as 1020 to about 586 BCE, the Israelites continued to be indistinguishable from their neighbors in terms of worship. According to Lang, the Israelites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Tyrians, and all other participated in similar West Semitic polytheistic cults. And remember when we had, if you want to hear this, you can go back, find here on my YouTube channel, you can find the old series I did on David, King David, and it kind of subtitled along the title of an old book I read, the David, the real life story of an imaginary hero, or an invented hero, the apologetic of David. But what did David do? He went in to all these little towns and he became the conqueror. He made himself king. He, in this sense, usurped the kingship of Israel from Saul before him. And you've got all these different enemies. There's all this information in there that we talked about. But there was this polytheistic cult. And what did David do? Once he conquered Jerusalem, he established Jerusalem as the sacred site, the cultic center of Jehovah worship in what became Israel. And so like its neighbors, the kingdom of Omri, Israel, had this clan god, and each city in the kingdom had a city god, and each family adopted a family god. And so the Ammonites worshipped Milcom as their national god. The Assyrians worshipped Ashur. The Egyptians worshipped Amun or Amun-Ra, except during Akhenaten's reign, when it became the Aten, at least in Amarna. And the Moabites worshipped Chemosh. The Philistines worshipped Dagon, and the Israelites worshipped Yahweh, Jehovah. And while Yahweh was Israel's national god and was charged with the protection of the king and the kingdom, he was not considered to be the creator god. And even if you look in the Old Testament, you've got Elohim is the creator god. Yahweh is a later form of God that came on the scene. There's no explanation. Two different entities, Elohim and Yahweh, or Jehovah. And so according to this biblical scholar Richard Friedman, both Israel and most of its neighbors believe that the world was created by the god El, Elohim. El was portrayed as a young bull. He was sometimes referred to as Bull El or Baal. El is also referred to as Elohim, which some scholars believe to be a plural form of his name, as we've talked about. Elohim, El, God, Him, plural suffix in the Hebrew language. So the Canaanite god El combined with the Hebrew Him, Elohim, God among many gods, was the name of God, or God of many gods, whichever way you want to interpret that. And all the gods is kind of where what Elohim really means. Now, even the book of Genesis tells us that El created the world. Blessed be Abraham by El, says Genesis 14. The Most High, the creator of heaven and the earth. The worship of Yahweh and El appears to have coexisted at the same time, while peacefully for some time. Biblical historian Morton Smith, he notes that the temple of El, or Bethel, in Israel, means the house in Hebrew, house of El, became a center of worship for Yahweh without changing its name. David went to Bethel and took the Ark of the Covenant from Bethel and moved it to Jerusalem. Bethel, the house of El. El and Yahweh may have been viewed over time as really the same or very similar deity. But eventually Yahweh was equated with and transplanted El in Jewish literature. This didn't occur, however, until after the Babylonian exile, when they came back and when the scriptures were rewritten at the Library of Alexandria. The Septuagint was created. At least one biblical passage, Genesis 2:7, clearly shows that the equating and eventual supplantation of El by Yahweh, when it says this, that Elohim, that is Yahweh, formed man. How, when, and why Yahweh came into prominence is something we're going to look into a little deeper. We're not going to get into it very deep because we've only got a few minutes today, but hopefully trudging through a bit of this history gives you a picture of how Israel came to be, how its leader, Moses, codified a monotheistic religion, yet how God and his prophets and the temple worship and all of this constantly fighting the Israelite people who wanted to fall back into this polytheistic system of belief and worship. As we've already kind of discussed regarding the mystery religions, the blending of spiritualities in a syncretic way was common throughout this period and in this region surrounding Palestine or Canaan, continuing through the last days of Solomon's temple. Smith notes that an archaeological find, which some may think have been Solomon's temple, contains images of other deities in a room in which incense was burned to them. And at the northern gate of the temple, women kept observance to the god Tammuz, and in the inner court of this temple, men were allowed to worship the sun god Shamash. Archaeologists have found evidence of the worship of Shamash in a number of holy sites around Jerusalem, dating from the 8th and the 9th centuries. We're talking smack in the middle of the Davidic and Solomonic dynasties in Israel. These practices occurred in the temple, and this is really indicating that the priests of Yahweh, of Jehovah, didn't see the worship of Yahweh as exclusive, and that it could coexist with the worship of other deities. And these practices could not have occurred without the consent and the cooperation of the priests of Yahweh. While there may have been priests who saw the worship of Yahweh as exclusive. They were not in the majority at this time. The land of Israel struggled with its spiritual identity, but they also blended monotheism and polytheism of the day. And so, you know what? We've got to stop there. There's so much more to this. I don't want to trudge us down in a historical study alone, because we're going to keep building to getting to this blending, this Christo-paganism. But I hope that you have seen to date in all of these studies that we've been doing that there is definitely a different history to the Christian faith than what we believed was there, and even a bit to the pagan faith. And so these things all start to blend together. And it's only not until recent being Christianity after the 3rd century where the Orthodoxy rose and separated things out. We're going to get more into that later. We're at the end of the show. I want to thank you for being here, folks. We're going to come back tomorrow night after a 23-hour break. We're going to hit this again. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll see you next time.